محمد وآل محمد salawat. Brothers and sisters, we would like to begin the program with the recitation of Holy Quran by Sulaiman Sundarji. Please welcome him with salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبح اسم ربك الأعلى الذي خلق فسوى والذي قدر فهدى والذي أخرج المرعى فجعله غثاء أحوى سنقرئك فلا تنسى إلا ما شاء الله إنه يعلم الجهر وما يخفى ونيسرك لليسرى فذكر إن نفعت الذكرى سيذكر من يشاء ويتجنبها الأشقى الذي يصل النار الكبرى ثم لا يموت فيها ولا يحيا قد أفلح من تزكى وذكر اسم ربه فصلى بل تؤثرون الحياة الدنيا والآخرة خير وأبقى إن هذا لصحف الأولى صحف إبراهيم وموسى.
Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. Please thank him again with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Brothers and sisters, today we are very fortunate to have Professor Liyakat Takim with us, who will be speaking to us about his new book. Please welcome him with salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Professor Liyakat Takim is a professor at the McMaster University. He has spoken at more than 120 academic, national and international conferences. He has spoken in different parts of the world, ranging from Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, East Africa, Dubai and North America. And his latest book, Shi'ism Revisited, Ijtihad and Reformation in Contemporary Times, was published by Oxford University Press in January 2022. And inshallah he'll be enlightening us about this book today. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين رحمة للعالمين بالقاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وقوله الحق. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. It's a great pleasure to be here once again. After a long time, mind you. I used to be a Londoner. Some of you might remember me. And wanted to discuss very briefly, we have about half an hour I think, on my latest book called Shi'ism Revisited and why I wrote the book. It took me about 10 years to write it, and during my research work in Iran, which was in 2011, I engaged in extensive conversation with especially the Iranian youth, many of whom expressed this concern that Islamic law was not up to date. In other words, it was not meeting the needs of the contemporary generation and the needs of the community at this time. The question that I tried to answer was that how can a religion, which is believed to be divinely revealed, how can it engage with and respond to the needs of a community, a modern community at that date? Sallu ala Muhammad wa alayhi. One of the problems with high tech is that it is too high for me. But anyway, inshallah, we'll be okay. Essentially, the question was, does Islam need a reformation? And if it does, how does it happen? In what direction should it proceed? Whenever we talk of a reformation, we normally tend to think of the Christian Reformation. And many tend to equate Islamic Reformation with Christian Reformation. And I'm saying no, the two are essentially different. Because the Christian Reformation, you may recall, started with Martin Luther, who was actually rebelling against the Pope, the misuse of the church by its authority of funds and so on. We do not have a churchhood in Islam. We do not have a Pope, neither do we have priestly class. What we do have are Maraji or Ayatollahs, who are essentially scholars in Islam. So an Islamic Reformation, if we were to call it that, would refer to a revisiting and reinterpreting and applying a fresh understanding of the text rather than a church or a particular group of scholars. In other words, we're talking of a commitment to make a religious experience relevant to the needs of the contemporary community. Essentially, what we have are many laws, and I will go into greater details this, which are sometimes discriminatory and prejudicial, especially against women and especially against non-Muslim minorities. The calls for reformation within the Islamic sphere is due to the practical needs of applying many of these laws in modern times. And this adjustment in laws is nothing new, by the way. When we go through the entire spectrum of Islamic juridical history, the history of Islamic texts, legal texts, we find many laws have been changed over time, scholars arguing, debating, and even rejecting the views of others. So I cannot go through the whole book, as you can imagine, the time is limited, but essentially in the first chapter I talk about the Islamic Reformation and also the question of hermeneutics, meaning interpretation. One of the great scholars in the field of interpretation is Gadamer, and he says that the meaning of a text goes beyond its author. In other words, the reader, not only the author, is central, because it is the reader who determines what it means to him or her. The author, according to Gadamer, plays a minimal role. It is the reader who plays a more important role. And that the meaning that is derived from any book, for that matter, is often contested and negotiated. Not only is it contested and negotiated, it evolves with time. In other words, there's no one central meaning that is applicable to all people at all times. More specifically, he also argues that readers are influenced and affected by the social and cultural environment. He calls it the horizon of understanding. Because of this, I come with my horizon of understanding, you come with yours, she comes with hers. We all have our prejudices. So how we see the same text will depend on our prejudices. And these prejudices or pre-understandings of a text makes it possible to understand a same text differently, and at the same time the same person can see the same text differently at different times according to how his or her horizon of understanding changes. More significantly, there is no objective or neutral stance when you read a text. And then I go on to discuss Mujtahid Shabistari, another one who talks of hermeneutics. He says that every text has a hidden reality, and that hidden reality is only revealed during the process of interpretation of a text, which leads to, importantly, plurality of readings of a text, meaning that there is no one reading of a text, and there is no final reading of a text either. He calls it the hermeneutical cycle, that there is a cycle whereby people through different times, different ages, sometimes even at the same time, read the same text differently. And no community or no person for that matter can claim to an exclusivist rendition of a text. In other words, I cannot come and say that this is my interpretation and only possible interpretation, because you can have your own understanding of the same text. In the second chapter, I go on to consider, because essentially what we are talking of is not only the text, but the interpretation of the text and how ijtihad works, the principle of ijtihad, meaning reasoning. And it's a special kind of reasoning, it's not personal reasoning. So I look at the whole history of ijtihad, and contrary to what we may think, in the early period of Islam, the Shias actually rejected ijtihad. for the simple reason that ijtihad was equated with qiyas. It was equated with ra'i, which means analogy. Qiyas is analogy, ra'i means personal reasoning. So whenever our early scholars, even like Sheikh Tusi, who died in 1067, or Sharif al-Murtada, died 1044, when they talk of ijtihad, they put it in the same chapter or the same section as qiyas and also as ra'i. Al-ijtihadu batilun, they say. Ijtihad is batil. In other words, they were equating ijtihad not the way that we understand it today, but they were equating it with unprincipled, free, haphazard reasoning. Hence, it was rejected by the Shia because we always insisted that when we read something, when we apply something, we need qat', Q-A-T. Q-A-T, qat' literally means certitude. In other words, what we have should be based on certainty. However, after the ghaibat of our Imam, and as the period between the Imam and the followers grew longer, there was a need to reapply, reinterpret those laws. And consequently, here we see human hermeneutical activity. In other words, human beings now are interpreting texts. And as long as there are human beings interpreting texts, you cannot have qat', you cannot have certainty. What you do have is dhan. Now, those who understand Persian, it's not the Persian zan. Persian zan means a wife. Here it means conjecture or a guess. So a wife is not a guesswork. So, okay. So the Shias rejected ijtihad during the times of the Imams simply because, as I said, they based the law, they wanted to base the law on qat', on certitude. The major breakthrough in Shia legal history comes with Muhakkik al-Hilli, who defined ijtihad, he redefined ijtihad as a way of valid conjecture. In other words, that guesswork which has been validated by the lawgiver, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, the knowledge that was generated by that ijtihad to be done by the scholars would be based on zan, on conjecture, but that zan which has been accredited and approved by the lawgiver. And later on, I go on to discuss in the second chapter about the akhbaris. And for those who may not be aware, akhbaris were Shias, they were scholars, many of them equivalent of what we may call a marja today, who completely rejected ijtihad and rejected taqlid completely. For them, this whole idea of ijtihad and taqlid is actually a bid'ah of the Sunnis, which was borrowed by people like Allama Hilli. So they were very critical of Hilli. However, even later on in the 19th century, we find that Murtaza Ansari, he goes on, especially after the Usulis became victorious over the Akhbaris. The Akhbaris were defeated by Bihbahani. Bihbahani dies in the year 1792. So that gives you a rough idea. In the 19th century, Murtaza Ansari, who was a student of Bihbahani, he went further by actually expanding the sphere of these uncertain terms. Although these principles were there, but he expanded in great details. Again, time does not allow me to go into those details. For a jurist to explore various possibilities when confronted with an issue that had no textual basis, which was not there in the text. And he talks of an elaborate principles of istishab, takhyir. Istishab means applying a ruling which was there from before, or even asalatul bara'a, which means that when you do not know a principle, you can assume that it is halal for you until you are sure that it is haram. And he goes on to talk about takhyir and ihtiyat and so on. What that tells me is that much of the Sharia, contrary to what we may think, is actually humanly constructed. It is not divine. The basic principles are divine, yes, but a lot of the laws are humanly derived and humanly constructed. And just because they are humanly constructed, they can be reconstructed. Ijtihad allows us not only to think, but also to rethink. Not only to formulate a law, but also to reformulate that law. So Ansari calls this usul al-amaliyya, that is the 4 principles, and he goes into great details whereby even he introduces a new element called shak. Before it was qat' and zan. He even validates shak based on these principles, expanding the sphere of Shia law. The third chapter, I talk of some of the tools that are available for scholars in their application of ijtihad. And most of these tools are actually rejected by the scholars, is because they are not based on qat or even zan al-mu'tabar. Zan al-mu'tabar is that zan, that conjecture which has been validated. So for example, the principle of maslaha. Maslaha means that which is in the interest of the people. The Sunnis apply it completely. But when you look at our what we call legal texts or usul al-fiqh text from the beginning, there is very little, if any, discussion on principle of maslaha. Simply because maslaha or welfare of the community is seen as based on haphazard reasoning, which is not approved by the lawgiver. So whereas the Sunnis do apply maslaha considerably, until fairly recently, especially after the establishment of the Islamic Republic in Iran, maslaha was primarily rejected. Now, by the way, there is actually a maslaha council in Iran because of the needs of the community. Importantly, I think in this chapter, I discussed the concept that pre-Islamic Arabs held many social laws based on their local customs. And many of these laws, pre-Islamic laws, were incorporated and endorsed by Islam. Many people seem to think that Islam brought all these laws. The ibadat, yes, but some have argued up to 90% of our mu'amalat laws are actually pre-Islamic laws. In other words, laws that were endorsed by Islam, as long as they were not going against the ethical framework of the Quran, they were accepted because they worked during that particular time. They were actually feasible during that time. I argue in this chapter that there is nothing in the Quran or in the prophetic hadith which indicate that the customary laws, these are urf means custom, the customary laws that Islam inherited and endorsed, that these laws cannot be transformed or modified at a later time and period. By the way, these laws are called ahkam imza'i. Imza'i means to endorse. There were three kinds of laws. One is ta'sisi, that Islam established. One is imza'i, one is, which it endorsed. And I forget the third one now. There were three kinds of laws, but the main one here are the imza'i laws, the one that it endorsed. Those laws that Islam accepted in the early period were laws that were considered by the Muslims and by the Prophet and even by the Imams as just and reasonable in their times, because laws are connected to the community, the society. If a community does not change its laws with time, those laws become an ideal rather than a reality. They cannot connect them with those laws. In fact, even in the Quran, less than 10% of the Quran's legal verses, in other words, we're talking of laws now, legal verses, were created new. Less than 10% were created new or prohibitive. 90% were those which were endorsed. So, for example, many of our marriage laws, business laws, laws on agriculture are actually pre-Islamic. And therefore, we find that many of our social laws are also patriarchal. I'm not ashamed to say it because they are. Many of them are and do not favor women, and I think that's not a secret. Therefore, we can say that the pre-Islamic laws were either accepted, they were modified, or rejected if they were seen as undesirable. Pre-Islamic urf was both sanctioned and Islamized by the early community. I'll repeat that. Pre-Islamic urf was sanctioned and Islamized by the early community. So that means that just because something is pre-Islamic, it does not mean that it's un-Islamic. In fact, even non-Islamic became Islamic, and pre-Islamic also became Islamic. Social and cultural laws prevalent during the Prophet's time are assumed to have been approved by him unless they were explicitly prohibited. So Islamic law then was often formed by endorsing prevailing customary laws that were neither determined nor dictated by the sacred texts, by the Quran or the Hadith. They were endorsed by them. So we find many institutions and laws and concepts and symbols in Islam that we take for granted today were actually non-Islamic at one time. The caliphate, the institution, I'm talking about the human beings as the caliphs, the institution of the caliphate is nowhere to be seen in the Quran or in the prophetic hadith. Similarly, domes, minarets, niches, the crescent itself are not mentioned in the Islamic text. They became Islamized. They were non-Islamic, they were not pre-Islamic, they were non-Islamic, but they became Islamized simply because they did not contravene any Islamic values. The fuqaha, the role of the scholars then was not only to derive new rulings from the text, but also, importantly, the role of the fuqaha was to ensure that what was discovered or created outside the text fell within the parameters of the text. Do you see what I'm trying to say? That the role of the ulama was not only to derive new laws, but also those laws which came into Islam, as long as they were not without against the boundaries of Islam, not against the ethical framework of the Quran, were actually Islamized. And this tells me something else. It's a bit controversial, as you can see. That had Islam emerged in a different environment, supposing Islam had emerged in a different environment, the social laws of Islam would have been different. Because the social laws of Islam was reflecting the society of that time. If Islam had emerged in India, for example, or in China, the laws of China from before Islam would have been very different from what we see today. There is nothing sacred, therefore, in the customary traditions that Islam endorsed. Some of these laws that Islam endorsed, there's nothing sacred about them, because large sections of those laws are humanly constructed and can be reconstructed. To put it differently, customary practices can influence a fatwa that is issued by a scholar. And I have quite a few articles on this. One of them is the role of customary law, of custom in Islamic law. So to give you one or two examples before we move on, the idea of covering the face, according to some at least, they say that it's mandatory. Some say that you should do it based on ihtiyat, including Ayatollah al-Khui. And Mutahari says that this was not there at the time of the Prophet. This was something that was injected into Islam, borrowed into Islam by later scholars. Sallu ala Muhammad. This imposition of 7th and 8th century Arabian customary laws, and these were Arabian laws, means that the current needs, the current moral values, the current siratul uqala means the behavior of those people of sound minds, intelligent people basically, and local customs are overlooked in favor of earlier laws. Those cultural laws at the time of the coming of Islam or even before Islam, which considered women to be intellectually deficient and that women required male supervision, these were pre-Islamic or early Islamic, are now imposed on us living in 21st century. Even though very frequently women are more educated than men, yet we see them, even today, that naqisul aql, as you've heard, intellectually, that's not my law by the way, just to make it clear. Those laws, the cultural laws, customary laws, are held to be universal, even though they were actually culturally and socially specific. So pre-Islamic urf then was both Islamized and sacralized. We deem them to be sacred. For us to engage in ijtihad today, in my understanding, entails a separation of the laws and values from the Quran against the cultural traditions present in those early period. In other words, a jurist, a scholar today must trace the origins of a particular law to determine whether it is divinely instituted, ta'asisi, whether Allah instituted it, or if it is imza'i, that is endorsed. If it is endorsed, then, and if there is a clash between our cultural understanding today and what if it is endorsed, then the reality, there is no conflict between Islamic law and our custom. The conflict is between the culture of that time and our culture today. Do you understand? Because these laws were reflecting the culture of that time, which Islam endorsed, but those cultural laws are conflicting with our cultural laws today. We're not conflicting between Islamic law and our culture. We are conflicting between pre-Islamic or early Islamic custom with our custom today. So this is a clash between customs, not between Islam and present-day laws. We cannot presume that the classical scholars could arrive at rulings that would serve the needs and interests of all future Muslims. Sheikh Tusi or Sheikh Mufid, writing in the 10th century, could not possibly derive laws that are applicable for us today. Neither does the Quran. The Quran does talk of urf. It does not restrict the urf to 7th century Arabia. It says, wa'mur bil urf. That is, conduct yourself based on urf. It doesn't say 7th century urf. It says urf. Neither does the Quran insist that all future laws must be based on 7th century urf. Thus, when the Quran talks of al-ma'ruf, we hear the term ma'ruf, amr bil ma'ruf. Ma'ruf is that which is commonly known. That is based on the urf, but is not necessarily 7th century urf. It's your urf also. Again, as long as it does not violate the ethical parameters of the Quran. So, the ma'ruf, as we talk about it, does not have to be anchored to a particular place. Because why? Even the pagan urf was endorsed by the Quran. Hence, we have laws in our books today, laws which permit and allow child marriages, that women cannot lead men in prayers, or questions of women's inheritance, or laws which prohibit women to travel without the consent of their guardians, or women's ability to give unilateral divorce, their ability to share guardianship with their children, custody, and so on. These laws can be visited or revisited and altered. You can see a lot of these laws apply to women. I do not doubt for one second that the Quran is divinely revealed, but the legal thrust of its message is frequently directed at a specific social, cultural, and historical context. And therefore, when those contexts change, then the laws can change also. In chapter 4, this was quite a long chapter, as you can see. The chapter 4, I have about 10 minutes, I think. I'm trying to fit in the whole book within that particular time. The 4th chapter, I initially say that the Shia contention that the moral worth of an act can be known objectively, that we can know what is right and wrong without the need of divine. In other words, there is a fitra, there is an innate disposition which tells us what is right and what is wrong. This highlights the role of reason in perceiving moral values, and it enables a mujtahid to infer new rulings based on moral and rational consideration. In other words, based on this principle that we know the value of an act independently of the lawgiver, we can actually derive new rulings based on moral and rational consideration within certain parameters, of course, especially when a particular question has not been endorsed in the textual sources. Because there is a correlation, what we call mulazama. كُلَّمَا حَكَمَ بِهِ الْعَقْلَ حَكَمَ بِهِ الشَّرَعُ. Whatever reason perceives, the divine will perceive the same thing. In other words, Allah has implanted reason in our mind. And when reasoning tells you that this is right, Allah cannot, and we're talking of not only one individual's reasoning, we're talking of the collective reasoning now of the community. If we all agree on a particular issue that this is morally right, Allah cannot come and tell you that this is wrong, because He implanted the reason in the first place. When we saw George Floyd being butchered in front of everybody, we all perceived that this is wrong, because we saw that this is morally wrong. So we call this the correlation between the will, the reasoning of the human and the will of the divine. This primacy or supremacy of reason over revelation means that the former can play, that is, reason can play a role in the formulation of rules. However, in reality, the truth of the matter, as Muhammad Baqir says, aql, as we call it, is a theoretical, rather than an actual source of law. There is very limited role of aql in our laws. And we have many laws, and I'm sorry to say this, but I know I've been brutally honest in this book. And I'm still waiting to be issue a fatwa against me, but it'll come, I'm sure. But there should be one? Yeah, you will issue the first one. In any case, Makarim Shirazi, for example, he argues against the practice that he deems to be morally wrong, even though the ulama have allowed it. That of mut'a with prostitutes. It is allowed, by the way. I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying what is allowed and what is not. He said this is against the ethical principle of the Quran and violates the basic principles of Shia law. How can we allow this? Also, other things like female genital mutilation. Many classical and medieval texts allowed it, claiming even to go even further that it is a recommended practice. And even contemporary scholars do allow it. We need to make the Sharia more moral and just. And therefore, the scholars need to search for and assert a universal ethical language in our laws. In my understanding, our laws and our ethics have bifurcated, almost divorced at times. We need to make the Sharia more moral and more just. A Sharia which acknowledges the dignity and nobility of all human beings, regardless of the ethnic, national, or religious affiliation. We as human beings and as scholars must question injunctions that degrade and discriminate against women, against minority groups, against non-Muslims, and even against fellow Muslims too. We, therefore, need to accept that judgments made by moral rationalism, we call it moral rationalism, means morality, which are not in the sacred sources, can act as an independent source of legislation. In other words, reasoning can also, moral values can also dictate our laws. So, for example, we have certain laws which says that you can remove a organ from a Muslim body only if you can give it to a Muslim body. You can take it from a non-Muslim, but you cannot give to a non-Muslim. I have a particular article on that. You can give but not take. No, you can take but not give. Sorry, and so on. So we are prohibited to dissect a Muslim body, but it's okay to dissect a non-Muslim body. A Muslim cannot be killed if he kills a non-Muslim. On the other hand, a non-Muslim must be killed if he kills a Muslim, unless, of course, he gives the diya, which, by the way, the diya, this is blood money of a Muslim, supposing it is $100, the diya, blood money of a woman, is $50, and of a non-Muslim is $12, that kind of stuff. You know, and then I go into this, but basically my contention in this chapter, chapter 4, is that a moral scholar does not necessarily produce a moral fatwa. A scholar may be moral, but many fatwas are immoral. And then the final chapter is where I try and produce a new kind of methodology, which is that the current form of ijtihad is too text-based, is too much based on the sources, and needs to be replaced by what I call Neo-ijtihadism. I called it post-ijtihadism until Professor Sachidina told me, don't use that term, that's not correct. It's not post-ijtihadism, it's neo-ijtihadism, so I accepted. So, and there are many other, I give many examples, which I don't have the time to go into. But so, for example, the zakat, the rate, although the Quran does not specify it, is 2.5%. Well, obviously 2.5% is not enough today for a government to run. And that's why many Muslim countries have actually borrowed laws and taxes from non-Muslim countries, because they fixed it at 2.5% because it was there at the time of the Prophet. It may have been sufficient at the time of the Prophet. But can you imagine having to pay only 2.5% tax at this time? I know I would love it, but it certainly would not be sufficient today. I go on to consider a scholar whom many of you may have heard of, Professor Fana'i, Abul Qasim Fana'i, in his book Akhlaq-e-Din Shinasi. And he talks of the legislative and the creative will of God. The creative will is when Allah creates something. And he says when Allah creates something, Our laws arise from that iradat takwini and iradat tashri'i. Takwini is that which He creates, which embody the ethics of Allah. In other words, dignity for all human beings, which the Quran says, right? That every human being has dignity, that equality of justice. This is takwini, what Allah creates. But the tashri'i is what Allah legislates, what He says we should do and not do. And Fanai says that the two cannot go against each other. In other words, what Allah wills should also be what Allah legislates. He cannot tell us to do something which is against His will. Otherwise, there will be a contradiction between what Allah wills and what He legislates. So therefore, he argues that God's legislative will follows His creative will. And our understanding of God's legislation, God's rule, is valid only if it is the same as His creative will. Do you understand? If His will is that all human beings are equal, our laws have to reflect that will. They cannot go against Allah's creative will. We cannot have laws which are unjust, because Allah Himself is just and wants us to be just to other human beings. Since these rights of justice, equality, dignity, they are intrinsic, they are within a human being, they cannot be obliterated, they cannot be removed by legislation. In other words, our hukm cannot go against the iradatullah. His thesis, Fanai's basic thesis, that since human beings are created by God and that they have their natural rights which are rooted in their very essence because they are human beings, and these cannot be removed, these rights are acknowledged and given to Allah before His legislation, because that is His creative will. That even Allah Himself cannot legislate a law which goes against His own creative will. If He creates with the intention that everyone has to be just, He then cannot give a law which is saying, well, some people can be treated unjustly, because that's against His own will. So therefore, I would argue that those laws or books which allow or promote discrimination between human beings are actually culturally or politically generated at a particular point in time. They do not reflect Allah's will. In other words, they are endorsed, transient, and mutable. They are changeable. And this is where we have the clash between what we call aql and naql. Very briefly, aql is that which reasoning arrives at, and naql is that which is transmitted in the text. Many a time we find that what is transmitted in the text goes against our own aql. And he argues, Fanai argues, how can naql, which is also based on zan, by the way, also based on conjecture, tell us to ignore aql, which is also based on zan? We have here two clashes, both of which are zan, both of which are based on conjecture. Aql and naql. And although the scholars say, well, naql has been endorsed by the lawgiver, in that Allah says, listen to what the hadith says. But what if the hadith goes against your conscience? Because our conscience now, our values, our way of understanding are culturally generated at this point in time. We collectively agree on them. And what happens if a hadith, which we're not 100% sure if it comes from the Ma'soom, goes against our current aql or our against understanding? Although it is true that Siratul Uqala, that is our collective laws, our collective thinking, tells us to obey the hadith, but our aql also tells us, the Sirah also tells us, that if there is a clash between aql and naql, then we have to look at that which is morally pure or proper at this particular point in time. You don't accept a hadith simply because it's hadith, even though if it goes against the collective conscience, not just mine or your conscience, collective conscience of the community. So therefore, rational judgments, that is reasoning, however moral or rational, have actually been neglected in the actual inference of the Sharia law many a time, because it goes against the naql. So because of this, we have today practices, in our books we have practices and customs like child marriages, deficiency of women, gender hierarchy, laws surrounding child custody, which were there at a particular point in time, premised on 7th and 8th century Arab tribal culture, these laws are taken as permanent and immutable. The sira, that is the uqala, the thinking of the collective conscious, if you like, which also depends on khabar al-wahid, states that when there is a clash, as I mentioned earlier, you accept that which is collectively accepted by the community. In other words, we need to look at the ethical precepts rather than mere legal injunctions of the Quran. I want to end now with this particular statement. Rather than being worried if a fatwa has been derived correctly, we need to be more concerned of whether it accords and agrees with the Quran's ethical tone. In other words, we need to look at whether it accords and agrees with the Quranic ethics. Scholars must bear in mind that the Sharia should be seen not only as an expression of divine will, but should also be seen, the Sharia should also be seen as an expression of divine morality and ethics. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I apologize for going slightly. And by the way, I'm not trying to market my book. I don't get much out of this. So it's Oxford University Press that gets it.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I had a few questions. You know, when you talk about, thank you for the lecture, by the way, it was really interesting. When you talk about urf as a cultural understanding, and we talk about the acceptability of urf, it's more of a comment, but earlier Islamic sort of pre-Islamic traditions were quite often, I feel, adopted by just changing the niyyah. So if you look at sort of circumventing the Kaaba, which was practiced pre-Islamically, but then was also practiced after Islam was introduced by simply changing the niyyah. So I don't necessarily, I was wondering what you thought about just sort of changing the niyyah of or the way we understand sort of cultural laws. My other question was, when it comes to, you mentioned aql being divine reasoning, that what is understood by aql is also divine. How do we ensure that what we understand out of our own mental reasoning is not influenced by power, by structural powers? Like there is something called mental colonization, whereby even our mindsets are impacted by people and places of power. So how do we ensure that our own reasoning, if we are to base our ethical understanding on our own reasoning, is not impacted by people of power who do not have our interests, best interests in mind?
Very good questions. The first one is not only a niyyah, it's also the changes or tweaking of certain laws. You're right, before they were going around the Kaaba clockwise and anti-clockwise. Similar laws, for example, on marriage. Before, the mahar was given to the bride's father, and Islam gave it to the father. So there were certain laws which were tweaked. Some laws were completely rejected, and some laws were instituted, especially the ibadat. So yes, there was a lot of correlation between pre-Islamic and Islamic laws. Some of them were just generally adopted. Okay. As for the second question, this is where I think what we need to look at is not only our reasoning, but our collective conscious as uqala. In other words, as intelligent people, not just of a particular community or of a particular people living in a particular society, is what human beings collectively see as correct or incorrect. So it could be, you're right, that a particular community which has been colonized or been influenced by another culture would see things in a particular way. But we're talking of Siratul Uqala, people who have what we may call collective consciousness, that everybody believes that no, killing is wrong, for example, or female genital mutilation is wrong in this cultural day and age, or that a woman should not have any guardianship or any say in the wilaya of the child is wrong. So these may have been correct or held to be correct at a particular point in time, but do they still apply? Because in my view, a woman or a mother rather has a much greater role to play in the guardianship and authority of a child than a father does. She knows the welfare of the child far more than a father does.
what sort of safeguards in this new way of doing things, even in collective reasoning, how do we sort of safeguard it from this mental colonization?
But the mental colonization is applied by one community over another. Here we're talking of the collective consciousness of human beings as human beings. Because there are two types of sira. The sira uqala, which is the sira of all human beings who have the collective consciousness, and siratul mutashari'ah, which is the sira of a particular community which abides by the sharia only. Do you understand? So we're talking here at the general level. So we Muslims can, because we abide by the sharia, we are bound by the siratul mutashari'ah, but we are also bound by the siratul uqala. And when the two clash, the two siras clash, then we go by the siratul uqala. Because the mutashari'ah can be generated at a particular point in time.
Just over here, yeah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Firstly, thank you for your talk, for such a interesting topic, which I came specifically for. I think you've answered the question that I had. However, any laws are guidelines at the end of the day and are only relevant if the person reading or person observing the law takes them seriously, and also if they can somehow be enforced, which you've answered this already, I think, which brings us back to the point, in a society that can enforce, or a state that can enforce laws, only then most laws are relevant, especially those that are dynamic and take into account culture as well. The other point leading on from this is a lot of times getting lost in laws and rules and guidelines leads to like analysis paralysis kind of situation. And if we as individuals, our fitra is somehow based on Islam or based on the laws of Islam, then for individual aspects of law or individual aspects of practice, if it makes sense to us, and if it's not really going to affect anyone else, and also if somehow nature, somehow the times, somehow our knowledge, and then tawakkal ala Allah, it somehow a lot of laws are relevant in that way as well. I don't know if I'm making sense here, but I'm trying to summarize what I understood from that.
If I understood it correctly, I don't know if I did. Are you saying that we can follow laws which we think, that I as a person think is correct, as long as it does not impact anybody else?
I'm not saying that. Firstly, most laws are based on social and political or cultural aspect. So a lot of laws are only relevant if in a society or in a particular setting or in a particular state who wants to enforce those laws. They're not relevant on many individual aspects. And on many individual aspects, there is a lot of flexibility.
I'm not sure I understand exactly.
I'm just making a comment there.
Okay, thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
I like your medieval lecture, but can I ask you a question? Will your book become obsolete in about 6 years' time when the AI community is set up?
Probably within a year's time.
AI? How will the situation develop when we have an AI community? Will you be lecturing them in that manner? Will that apply?
Well, I don't know if I know enough. In fact, I don't know anything about the AI. Maybe we can ask AI itself and see what they say.
In 10 years' time, yes.
No, even now.
No. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum.
You mentioned about إرادة تكويني و تشريعي. Sorry, قانون تأسيسي, قانون إمضائي. So the تأسيسي is the one that Islam established it, yeah?
Yeah.
So, and then you said majority were the MZI, were the ones that actually brought in. So which bits are tacit? Most of the stuff that you said are all MZI in any case. About the hijab, you mentioned that it is only what they were doing before in any case. the covering the face. I don't even know whether they're actually covering the hair is also emzai or is it ta'sisi. There's no clarity about it in any case. So that was a bit I wanted to ask. And the other thing you mentioned about Amr bil Ma'ruf, you said what is local and what is colloquial. So you decide that. That in this area, in this culture, they may come up with so many different laws, which they feel this is Amr bil Ma'ruf here because everybody accepts it here. So how do you then define that against the, like Islam, something like that?
Against the?
Against what the norm of Islam is right now. I mean, Amr bil Ma'ruf, they say, well, you got to do this, you got to do that, yeah? But they're saying, for example, homosexuality as an example, or this LGBTQ, whatever. So that these days is Amr bil Ma'ruf, seems to be Amr bil Ma'ruf. And would that be Amr bil Ma'ruf then or not?
That's Amr Munkar. Anyway, as far as this first one, most of our ibadat are ta'asisi. Most of our laws on ibadat are ta'asisi. In other words, salat, zakat, khum, and so on, and hajj, the way that we know it now with all the rituals, were actually established by the lawgiver. They are new laws. They are not imza'i. The hajj itself, some of the rituals maybe, but the majority are ta'asisi, other ibadat. Yeah, a lot of the social laws, the majority of social laws are imza'i. Okay? And ma'ruf also comes with a caveat. That is, ma'ruf can only be applied if based on siratul uqala, that is the intelligent people, and also be if it does not go against the Sharia principles, in other words, divine legislation. On the question of LGBTQ, for example, there's a very clear injunction in the Quran and in the Hadith about regarding its hurma. Because of that, based on a local ma'ruf in a particular society, we cannot say that, okay, well, this is fine because it's ma'ruf in this particular society. Because ma'ruf comes with a lot of conditions too. Do we have time, or is it time for salah?
I think it's time for salah, so we'll end there. Thank you very much. Muhammad wa ala Muhammad salawat. Professor, are you around after prayers? Inshallah, people can have a chat with you? Or?
Yeah, I should be here for a little while.
Right, thank you very much.
Chai check or nothing?
With tea, of course.
If there's no chai, then I'm not here.
So, you know what? I found out an hour ago that you're here. Luckily, I checked.
Coach, I don't have an extra copy.
No, I wanted a signed copy.
You have to
It's a long time. You know, the last time we met, I'll tell you we met. We met with Fazal Milani and your brother 5 years ago.